There are three editions of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein that were published in her lifetime. The first edition from 1818, second edition 1823, and a final edition 1831. Until quite recently, scholars maintained that the 1831 edition was authoritative, the edition that should be used in classrooms, say, the edition that scholars should use in studying the book. However, there's been a shift in theories of editing over the past decades that more and more tends to assume that earlier editions are more likely to reflect an author's views than later editions. For instance, think of Wordsworth. Wordsworth's Prelude was not published until 1850, the year he died. And for the longest time, scholars assumed that the 1850 edition was the most authoritative. Why? Because it contained the revisions that Wordsworth made on his poem for almost 45 years. So why not assume that the revisions coming later in life would express the author's true intent, as opposed to an earlier edition which may not have been thought through to the extent that later edition would be. Well, scholars more and more have claimed, no, the 1805 is the authoritative edition of Wordsworth's The Prelude. Why? Because it is closer to the time he actually composed the poem, and therefore it reflects the originality and force of his vision more so than a later edition would. Same logic applies to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So I would say now in the Academy, most would maintain that the 1818 is the superior text, the superior version of the novel for capturing Mary Shelley's views, again, of her story when she wrote the book. I want to talk about a few differences between the 1818 and the 1831 to give you a sense of how they differ, yes, obviously, but also to give a sense of why, at least I think, that the 1818 is more suitable for our purposes. So, in the 1818, Victor is taught about science from his father, Alphonse Frankenstein. And in the father's instruction, Alphonse tells Victor that there is something called a fluid, like an electrical or galvanic fluid that runs through everything. And Alphonse shows us specific knowledge of this fluid. Mary Shelley was clearly drawing here on the work of Sir Humphrey Davy, a great scientist of electricity that thrived in England in the 1800s, 18 teens. Close friends with Coleridge, in fact. And basically, Davy proved that matter itself is not solid, but is a field of energy. What is that energy? It could be a kind of highly rarefied liquid. It could be a more invisible or impalpable force. But in the first edition of 1818, the father is the one who conveys scientific knowledge to Victor and gets Victor excited about science. And it's the father who shows a very specific knowledge of theories of electricity and galvanism of the time. By 1831, Mary Shelley has a stranger visiting the Frankensteins tell Victor about the spark of life, the spark of nature. So it's as if Victor is somehow pressed upon by an outside force, maybe even victimized by an outside force. Victor uses the language of victimization quite a bit in the 1831. The idea being that here I was living my life, and this stranger comes in and tells me about science, and suddenly I am going to be obsessed with science the rest of my life, and that will ultimately inspire me to create this creature and ruin my life. It's not there in the first one. In 1818, there's a sense that the scientific knowledge comes from within comes from within Victor's circle and is not fantastical so much as just grounded in actual science. So this puts more emphasis on Victor to be responsible for himself. He got the scientific knowledge from his father. It was responsibly rendered scientific knowledge, and Victor should be responsible for how he uses it. That goes away again in 1831. In general, 1831, there's much more emphasis on fate, a kind of blind fate pushing Victor around. More emphasis in 1818 on responsibility. That's one difference too. In 1818, Elizabeth, who becomes Victor's romantic interest, is actually his cousin. She was the daughter of Victor Frankenstein's father's sister. The sister had fallen on hard times, so Victor's family had decided to take her in. So he's brought up with a relative, and he actually falls in love with his relative, she with him. So there's a hint of incest. In Mary Shelley's time, this wouldn't necessarily have been aberrant for cousins to be in love with one another, but as the century progressed, it may have been seen as less appropriate. But there's more going on here, I would maintain. I feel like one of Victor's issues is that as he develops, he becomes increasingly selfish. It's as if he wants the world to conform to his desires exactly as they are. And if the world doesn't conform to his desires, then he wants nothing to do with that world. And to grow up with a love interest who is your family member, there's not a sense that he's having to reach outside of himself, outside of his familiar sphere, to court, to gain the affection of someone other than he. Perennially, incest outside of its biological context has been kind of a trope for narcissism. The idea that if you have incestuous desires, you basically are just in love with yourself, your own gene pool, as it were. Well, for Victor, again, to be romantically connected to his first cousin, to me, is a way of emphasizing Victor's narcissism, his egocentrism, which, as you will see, plays out in the novel in tragic ways. So by the time we get to 1831, Elizabeth is some orphan found in a port city and brought home by Alphonse, Victor's father, and the family charitably decides to raise her. Now, Victor will call her cousin now and again as a term of affection, but she's not his cousin at all at this point. She's just kind of this angelic figure, totally idealized figure. It's almost like she's not real anymore. So again, in 1818, there's more of a sense about what I'll call kind of groundedness, particularity, tactility. By the time we get to 1818, the science is removed, and also Victor's love interest is more abstract, ideal, wispy. Okay. A third important difference. In the 1818, there's a real emphasis on responsibility, as I said, and this is manifest very powerfully when the creature actually becomes animated. Victor sees the creature and he is horrified at what he's created, and he abandons the creature immediately, and he feels deeply upset over having abandoned this creature. In other words, it's as if Victor is aware of the fact that he's created a kind of child, and like a bad parent, a neglectful parent, he just leaves his child to the child's own designs. And he feels deep remorse over that. In the 1831, there's more of a sense that Victor wants to play God and create a new race, and that somehow he's fated to do that. So there is a sense that Victor abandons the creature when it comes to life in 1831, yes. But there seems to be a shift in tonality, more of an idea again that the transgression is not abandoning the creature, but in creating the creature in the first place, and being a kind of Luciferian, satanic violator of some kind of natural law. So again, we move away in 1831 from this idea of like concrete connection to a more sort of abstract theoretical sense of things. Now, these are three important differences. There are others, but basically, it seems to me like the 13 years between 1818 and 1831, some terrible things had happened to Mary Shelley, and I'm just speculating here. It's always tricky to extrapolate from a writer's biography meanings in the text, but between 1818 and 1831, Mary Shelley had lost two children to death, and she'd lost her husband, um, Percy, to death. So there's I think there's a sense in 1831 of there is some kind of cruel fate running the world, blind, amoral, and there's nothing we can do about it. There's much less a sense of agency and responsibility in 1831, and one can see why. If you've suffered tragedies like this, three of your most beloved people dying, then one can see how the move from I'm kind of responsible for what's happening to me to this is horrific, this is terrible. There's no way anyone can be responsible for such awful things. There's got to be something really cruel at work in the universe. So I think we see that in the 1831, and that's one main reason for the shift. It's even interesting. Another huge difference between 18 and 31 is that in 1818 there's just a very brief little preface. But by the time we get to 1831, there's a really long preface that goes into great detail about the origin of the story, the circumstances that were in play. But by the end of the preface, Mary Shelley's writing about her novel as if she had no control over making it. She says, "Oh, this is my hideous progeny. It's gone forth out of me." And she speaks as if her husband's influence or Lord Byron's influence had somehow informed her desire to make the book, and the book is like this kind of monster that she's not responsible for that goes out into the world. So I feel like by the time we get 1813, that Mary Shelley is not only is she just ruined by grief, but also she's suffering financial difficulties. She's just not in a very good place existentially. So she just seems to want to say these things are happening. I'm not responsible for these things are happening. There's a kind of removal from the messiness and the just the grit of life. Life's too much. Let me pull back from it. Whereas when she was younger in 1818, I think there was more of a sense of hopefulness and vibrancy, and that comes across in the novel.